Hello, U.S. history students. And in this, the second of two lessons for this week, we are going to talk about the collapse of Reconstruction. Okay. Now, we've talked about the background, Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, the Radical Republican plan. We've talked about the fact Lincoln's assassinated. Johnson is not strong like Lincoln, so he is not able to carry out Lincoln's plan, even though he would sort of like to do that. So the Radical Republicans are going to be in charge of Reconstruction, and things are going to go on a drastically different path than what Lincoln had envisioned. And because of that, that is going to affect the impact of Reconstruction for years to come. All right. And that's what we're going to talk about today with this. All right. Now, as you watch this presentation or you listen to this presentation, feel free to take your own notes, but also feel free to use the notes that I have provided you on Canvas to keep track of the material. Okay. Now, many Southerners did not like the idea of greater rights for African Americans. All right. They didn't have a problem with slavery ending, but they weren't sold on the idea that African Americans should have greater rights. In that respect, there were Northerners that felt the same way. Okay. In fact, some of the most racist writings, in my opinion, from this period of time come from Northern Democrats. If you've ever seen the movie Lincoln, you could see that there were Northern politicians that were very much opposed to the 13th Amendment and then later the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. Okay. So there do seem to be a majority of Southerners that don't like this idea, but keep in mind, this is not a popular idea in the North either. All right. There are a lot of people that aren't completely sold on the idea of greater rights for African Americans. Now, that being said, in the South, we see the rise of the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the KKK was formed by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a former Confederate general. Okay. And their job, they are considered a terrorist organization because the tactics they use, they targeted specific groups like carpetbaggers, scallywags, and African Americans. Okay, now remember, carpetbaggers were those Northerners that came south, and they're associated with corruption and bribery. They were taking advantage of the South at a time when the South is feeling very, very defeated and very demoralized. Scallywags were white Southerners that had not supported secession and seemed to be in support of the Reconstructionist policies of the North. So all of these groups are being targeted specifically by the KKK, which was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. And the reason we call it a terrorist organization is because they would use violence and scare tactics to try to intimidate these groups. Now, a lot of those scare tactics and a lot of that violence was targeted specifically at African Americans. And one of the big things they wanted African Americans not to do was vote. Okay. They were trying to keep African Americans from voting. All right. They also attacked African Americans who owned land. All right. And the bottom picture shows you one of those scare tactics. One of the images that is associated with the KKK is the burning cross. All right. And you can see from both images, of course, they're wearing white hoods and white robes to disguise their identities. Okay. And of course, at night, they appear to be like ghosts. And this is at a time when people were very, very superstitious. So you have these people riding around at night with hoods and white robes. They look scary, and they're doing things like using violence and burning crosses. So that is why it's considered a terrorist organization, because of the tactics they are using to try to intimidate carpetbaggers, scallywags, and blacks. Okay. Now, that's kind of the background of what's going on. Now, let's talk about the collapse of Reconstruction itself. Radical Republican control began to weaken in 1869. Okay, so the radical Republicans who've been calling the shots in Reconstruction, their political power begins to decrease at the end of the 1860s. Their power is decreasing while power in the southern states is increasing. Okay. And we talked about last week, southern states had to have a plan before they could be readmitted to the Union. But by the 1870s, the North is having a difficult time keeping the southern states out. So as radical Republican control begins to weaken, the southern states are beginning to rejoin the Union. Okay. And all these years of frustration and all these feelings of defeat and demoralization, and they see themselves as backwards and things like that, all that's been building up. And as these southern states begin to rejoin the Union, they begin to bolt from the Republican Party. Okay. They reestablish state governments, and those new state governments are going to join the Democratic Party. And the southern states are going to purposely begin to elect white Democratic leaders to replace the military governments of the radical Republicans. Okay, so this is what I've been saying all along. The radical Republicans are going to make a mess of Reconstruction because all their policies, okay, are now coming back to bite them. And as these southern states gain re-entry into the Union, they're going to use their new reestablished political power to choose a different party. And they're headed toward the Democratic Party, and they're going to elect white Democratic leaders to the government. Northerners are also growing tired of Reconstruction. Okay, and like I said, there are a bunch of Northerners that are not concerned about rights for African Americans. In fact, they're growing tired of continually hearing about rights for African Americans. So it's not just the Southerners that are getting upset, but Northerners are getting upset too, and they really are, and they're getting tired of the radical Republicans as well. Okay, in 1872, the radical Republicans lose control of Congress. Okay, they've been controlling Reconstruction, they've been controlling the Congress up to 1872. In 1872, they lose control, right? And the new Congress is going to pass the Amnesty Act. The Amnesty Act is going to restore voting rights to 160,000 former Confederates, right? And of course, we've already talked about those former Confederates are going to use this new political power to elect white Democratic leaders in opposition to the Republican Party. Okay. Now, our next big election is going to come in 1876. The presidential election of 1876 will officially end Reconstruction. Okay. Notice that I have that bolded there on the presentation. That is because if you ever see this question, what ends Reconstruction? It is the presidential election of 1876. The radical Republicans have already lost control of Congress. 1876, we've got a new presidential election, and the votes come back tied. You had a Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, and the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. The Republicans, and I'm not just talking about the radical Republicans now, the Republican Party in general, the Republicans want to keep the White House. They've had Lincoln. There was a slight interruption with President Johnson, but remember, Johnson had been on Lincoln's ticket, but he was still considered a Democrat. But then they've had 2 years of Grant, okay? And Grant was a Republican. So the Republicans are very much interested in keeping control of the White House. So a deal is struck. In return for support in the Electoral College from these new Southern Democrats that have gained power since 1872, the Republicans will agree to end Reconstruction and end military occupation of the South, okay? Because once the military occupation is over, Reconstruction is going to be over too, okay? So that is the deal that is broken. The Republicans want to keep the White House. They themselves are getting tired of Reconstruction. The South is definitely tired of Reconstruction. So these new Southern Democrats say, look, we'll throw our support behind your guy, Hayes. Hayes can become president, and the deal is you guys got to end Reconstruction. And the Republicans who want to keep the White House say, that's fine, we'll do that. So Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the new president, not Samuel Tilden. Right? That is going to lead to the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 is going to enable those former Confederates who now control the Democratic Party to regain power, especially in the South. and the South is going to unite as a single voting bloc. It's going to be called the Solid South. Now, what's interesting is for several years, okay, it voted solidly Democrat. But then I told you can't use those political terms to necessarily think about the parties today. And when the party philosophy switches, that Solid South is going to start voting traditionally Republican. Okay, so this idea of the South voting together as one, we are going to see for several years to come. Now, it's starting to break up a little bit, especially in this last election, with Georgia, which is typically seen as a red state, going blue. Virginia has been red for several years. It has been going blue. Different things like that. But we still see this solid South voting bloc for years to come. Now, what that's going to open the door to is the Jim Crow era. And that Jim Crow era is going to begin a long period in which African Americans in the South are denied their full rights of American citizenship. Okay, I've been telling you Reconstruction is an utter failure, that once the radical Republicans lose power and Reconstruction is over, we're going to see racism and discrimination come back. Well, here it comes in the Jim Crow era. Now, it's also important to remember slavery itself does not come back. Okay, I had a student a couple of weeks ago saying slavery comes back. No, slavery does not come back, but discrimination and segregation do. Okay, now we get the term Jim Crow era from Jim Crow laws. We're going to use the term Jim Crow laws and black codes interchangeably. Specifically, Jim Crow laws prevented blacks from voting. Okay. Now, how would you go about doing that? Because the 14th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendment guarantees rights to African Americans, and the 15th Amendment specifically guarantees the voting right. Well, the South says, okay, that's fine. But before they can vote, everybody has to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test or own property. Okay, everybody has to do that, and that's how they get around it and say, look, we're not being discriminatory or we're not being racist. Everybody has to do that. But if you look, okay, yes, everybody has to pay a poll tax, but the poll tax is probably going to be higher for African Americans. Now, let's say they can pay the poll tax. They got to pass a literacy test. Literacy test, in some respects, you were given a passage to read, and then you have to tell about what you read. Okay, a white person might be given a nursery rhyme or a fairy tale or something like that. Black person might be given a part of the Constitution. Not many people, I don't care who you are going to pass a literacy test if you have to read and then tell us what the Constitution says. Okay. Now, if they can pass that, do they own property? Okay. So there are these catch-all systems, all right, to prevent African Americans from voting. All right. If you can pass one tax or one test, can you pass them all? Probably not. And chances are it's also going to catch poor white folks as well. So that's another way that the new former Confederate governments that are coming back, that's another way they justify it. It's like, look, again, everybody has to meet these requirements. Black people and white people aren't able to meet these requirements. That's why it's not racist. Okay. Now, it is still discriminatory because most freed slaves cannot meet any of those requirements. Okay. But on the off chance that they can, there are going to be some white people that can't meet them as well. And like I said, there will be differences in those tests to really try to keep newly freed slaves from meeting those requirements. Okay. So Jim Crow laws specifically are supposed to target voting. Then you got the black codes. The black codes come back, and the black codes simply refer to any area of segregation. Okay, the black codes are going to separate the races. This is where we're going to get separate but equal later on down the road. The Jim Crow laws are probably a subset of the black codes. Okay, the Jim Crow laws are going to use segregation, are going to use discrimination to keep people from voting. All right, so the black codes in general bring back segregation, discrimination. If we're specifically talking about voting, it's going to be the black codes bring back segregation, discrimination. If we're specifically talking about voting, it's going to be the Jim Crow laws. But you will hear those terms used interchangeably when people talk about this period of time and when people talk about the civil rights movement when we get the 1960s, 1970s. Okay. Now, in the end, Reconstruction is failure. Okay. The rights that African Americans had been given begin to be whittled away. Okay. And they are not going to gain the equal rights that they deserve. They're not going to gain the equal rights that they're promised. And we're going to have to get to the civil rights movement before we can see some noticeable change. And even up until now, we're still dealing with the outcome of this. Okay. But there is hope. All right. Number one, like I said, slavery doesn't come back. Nobody tries to bring slavery back. Okay. And most importantly, even though you got these former Confederates coming back and these new Democratic governments in the South, and they seem to be controlling Congress and things like that, even though you got that, they don't do anything to the 14th or the 15th Amendments. The 14th and 15th Amendments are still part of the Constitution. Okay? And I know the discrimination is out there, the racism is out there, and that is bad. But you know what? Nobody ever gets rid of the 14th and 15th Amendments. All right? Nobody tries to vote them out. No, they don't gain enough support to do that. Okay? The 14th and 15th Amendments are still part of the Constitution. And later on down the road, we are going to see them used to strengthen African American rights and, to be honest with you, to strengthen rights for everybody. I've already told you the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote. Well, down the road, we're going to talk about the amendment that gives women the right to vote. That amendment is going to be built out of the 15th Amendment. Okay? Other groups that feel discriminated against or segregated, they're going to gain increased civil rights because of these 14th and 15th Amendments. So, Reconstruction is horrible. It does not last. It is going to set us up for so many problems down the road. We are still dealing with that today. But there's hope, guys. Slavery doesn't come back, and the 14th and 15th Amendments are still in the Constitution. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about those later this year when we get to the civil rights movement.